8 seconds is all it takes to end a man in corporate America. Not with a punch, not with a threat, with a sentence spoken casually like it doesn't matter. Pack it up, old man. No anger, no heat. Just the cold confidence of someone who believes the system will protect him. That's how power really moves now, softly, bureaucratically, wrapped in polished language and performance metrics. And if you've lived long enough inside those buildings of steel and glass, you know the truth. Humiliation is the preferred weapon. It leaves no marks, no lawsuits, no witnesses willing to speak. What you're about to hear isn't a feel-good revenge story. It's a warning. Because the men who get destroyed the worst are the ones who think loyalty is currency that decades of service buy immunity. They don't. They buy invisibility. Picture the room: mahogany table, ergonomic chairs. A skyline view meant to remind you who owns your time. On one side, executives who learned leadership from podcasts. On the other, a man whose fingerprints are literally in the foundation beneath them. Veteran, builder, silent, watching the ceremony of his own erasure. Here's the first forbidden truth: corporations don't fire you when you fail. They fire you when you become inconvenient to the narrative. When your presence reminds them that real power doesn't come from slides, buzzwords, or titles printed on business cards. The boy delivering the sentence thinks he's in control. He believes authority flows downward, from board to CEO to VP to employee. That's what they teach him. What they never teach him is that real leverage often sits quietly off the org chart waiting. And the man being humiliated understands something the room doesn't. Panic is expensive. Emotion leaks information. Silence, on the other hand, lets you see the whole board. As you listen, ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many men like him have you seen escorted out with a cardboard box while everyone pretended it was just business? How many times did you assume the story ended there? It didn't. Because when you humiliate a man who helped build the ground you stand on, you don't end a career. You awaken something older than corporate policy, something patient, precise, and very hard to stop. Here's what they never tell you about moments like that conference room execution. The humiliation isn't for the man being fired, it's for everyone watching. It's a ritual, a warning shot wrapped in professionalism, a message sent without ever being written down. Watch how the room behaves when a veteran is cut loose. Eyes drop, pens move on empty paper, breathing gets shallow. Everyone silently recalibrates their own position in the food chain. If it can happen to him, it can happen to me. That fear is more valuable to management than any quarterly bonus structure. The young executive, Bradley, whatever his parents named him, didn't invent this cruelty. He inherited it. He learned it from boardrooms where empathy is considered a weakness and loyalty is a liability on a spreadsheet. His power wasn't personal. That's the mistake people make. It was systemic, sanitized, approved. And the man across from him knew that. That's why he didn't argue. Arguing accepts the premise that the other side has authority over your dignity. Silence denies them that pleasure. Silence forces them to sit with the echo of their own voice. There's a reason executives hate calm exits. They want emotion. Anger gives them justification. Tears give them superiority. Begging confirms hierarchy. But when a man stands, nods, and accepts the verdict like a closed chapter, it unsettles them. It breaks the script. Here's the second forbidden truth. The corporate world runs on scripts, performance reviews, exit interviews, diversity statements, innovation speeches, every role pre-written, every outcome anticipated, until someone refuses to play their part. As he walked back to his desk, carrying decades in his posture, the building watched. Infrastructure always does. When you've been somewhere long enough, you stop being seen as a person and start being treated like a fixture, like wiring in the walls or beams in the ceiling. People say dangerous things around fixtures. They assume they don't listen. That's when the whispers start. Not cruel enough to confront him directly, just loud enough to establish dominance. He prints emails. My dad's age. Finally. These aren't insults. They're reassurances people tell themselves to justify survival. If they can reduce him to a joke, they don't have to confront the truth. That experience was just declared obsolete. But here's where the story quietly shifts and most people miss it. While everyone else is watching the box, the walk, the optics, he's inventorying something else. Knowledge, access, history, patterns. The invisible map of how this place really functions. Because long tenure doesn't just mean time served. It means secrets accumulated. It means knowing which systems were patched temporarily and never fixed, which shortcuts became permanent, which clauses everyone forgot existed because they were inconvenient to remember. You see, corporations age like badly maintained buildings. The outside gets renovated, the lobby shines, the slogans change, but the structure underneath, that stays the same. And the men who built it know exactly where the stress points are. This wasn't the end of a career. It was the beginning of leverage. The box is always cardboard. That's not accidental. Cardboard is cheap, temporary, disposable. It's meant to reduce a human life into something you can carry in one trip. Years of labor compressed into a rectangle with folding flaps. Corporate alchemy at its finest. As he packed, he didn't rush. That's another thing that unsettles people. Speed signals weakness. Hurry suggests loss. Slowness, on the other hand, tells the room you still own your time, even now. Especially now. He didn't take everything. Men like him never do. They take only what matters. A photograph that reminds them who they were before the building. A mug with words that mean something real, not a motivational quote printed by HR. And one small object no one noticed. A piece of stored memory that didn't live on the company's servers. Here's a truth you won't hear at leadership seminars. The most dangerous men in corporate life are the ones who don't look dangerous. They blend. They comply. They document. While others chase visibility, they accumulate optionality. HR hovered nearby, performing empathy the way actors perform grief in a scene written by lawyers. Apologies wrapped in disclaimers. Sympathy constrained by policy. She said it wasn't her call. That's always the line, as if responsibility evaporates once it's been passed upward. But listen carefully. It wasn't my call is how systems train good people to do bad things without ever feeling accountable. That sentence has ended more careers, families, and identities than outright malice ever could. When he said he was fine, when he said change was sometimes necessary, it wasn't forgiveness. It was camouflage. Men who survive institutions learn when to show teeth and when to disappear into the brush. As he walked the halls one last time, the building revealed itself differently. The break room where he fixed what maintenance ignored. The server room humming on contracts he negotiated back when reliability mattered more than margins. Systems stacked on top of systems, held together by memory and habit rather than documentation. This is the third forbidden truth. Organizations forget faster than they replace. They assume yesterday's solutions will keep working tomorrow. They bet that no one will ever challenge the foundation because no one remembers who poured it. Passing the glass office, he saw the boy already laughing, already claiming space that hadn't been earned, feet on the desk. A future assumed, not secured. The mock salute through the glass wasn't cruelty, it was ignorance. The kind that comes from believing ownership and control are the same thing. When he stepped into the elevator, something symbolic happened. Elevators don't just move bodies. They mark transitions. One identity ends at the top floor. Another begins at the ground. In the lobby, the security guard asked an innocent question, leaving early, and the answer, something like that, carried more truth than anyone realized, because he wasn't leaving the building behind. He was stepping outside the illusion that the building belonged to them, and that distinction changes everything. The parking lot is where corporate theater ends. No glass walls, no witnesses pretending not to watch, just asphalt, heat, and the quiet hum of engines belonging to people still inside the machine. He sat in his truck without turning the key. That pause matters. Men who rush away from humiliation stay owned by it. Men who sit with it really strip it for parts. They study it. They decide how it will be used. From that angle, the building looked impressive. 4 stories, clean lines, expensive confidence. The kind of structure meant to signal permanence. And that's when the irony becomes almost poetic. Because permanence is an illusion sold to people who don't own the ground beneath their feet. Here's the fourth forbidden truth. Most executives don't know who actually owns the world they operate in. They control budgets, not assets, titles, not land. They manage illusions built on contracts no one bothers to read once auto pay is enabled. The young VP thought he had removed a liability. The board thought they had refreshed their image. What none of them realized was that they had just insulted the landlord. Ownership doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear name tags or sit at the head of the table. It hides in shell companies, trust structures, and long-forgotten agreements signed during moments of desperation. Ownership waits. He remembered the dirt lot, the survey stakes, the smell of wet concrete. He remembered writing a check that solved a problem no one else could solve at the time. And he remembered doing it quietly because loud men attract attention, and attention invites interference. That's the difference between power and authority. Authority needs to be seen. Power prefers to remain unnoticed until it's needed. When he picked up the phone, this wasn't revenge. Revenge is emotional, short-sighted, loud. This was enforcement. This was the natural consequence of disrespecting a system you never bothered to understand. The call was calm, familiar. A conversation between 2 men who spoke the same language, clauses, contingencies, and leverage. No threats, no drama. Just a request to pull the file. If you've never watched a legal mind shift gears in real time, you should know it's subtle. The voice changes. The questions stop being hypothetical. The past suddenly becomes relevant again. Clause numbers matter, especially the ones written by people who understood that someday, someone careless would come along and forget why those words were there in the first place. Here's the fifth forbidden truth. The most powerful weapons in corporate warfare aren't lawsuits or scandals. They're old agreements executed patiently by men who planned for arrogance long before arrogance arrived. When he ended the call, the air inside the truck felt different. Cooler, cleaner, possibility replacing humiliation. Not because someone was going to get hurt, but because order was about to be restored. As he drove away, the sign out front gleamed with its rebranded name, bought at absurd cost to impress investors who never visit. A monument to surface-level thinking. They had optimized for appearance. He had optimized for inevitability, and inevitability always wins. Power doesn't feel like rage when you finally touch it. It feels like clarity, like the noise dropping out of a room you didn't realize was deafening you for years. He didn't go home to celebrate. Men who understand leverage don't confuse motion with progress. He went home to prepare, quietly, methodically, the way you do when you're about to remind the world how consequences actually work. That house wasn't impressive. No gates, no marble, no performative success. That's another lie corporate culture sells. Flash equals dominance. In reality, flash is usually compensation. The truly dangerous men live plainly because they don't need witnesses. Inside, the box went on the table and stayed there, symbolic, unopened, because the past wasn't being mourned, it was being reorganized. Then he opened the drawer. Every long game has a moment like this. The moment where patience pays interest. Where something planned decades ago stops being theoretical and becomes active. The lease wasn't just paper. It was memory preserved in ink. Heavy stock, old language, precise phrasing written before executives learned to outsource responsibility to consultants. Clauses that assumed stupidity would eventually cycle back into the system. And there it was. The clause no one reads because no one thinks they'll need it. Structural alterations, written consent, material breach, termination rights. Here's the sixth forbidden truth. Corporations rely on momentum to cover negligence. They assume tomorrow will look like yesterday with better software. They don't plan for someone remembering the rules they forgot. He didn't smile. Smiling would have been premature. He logged in. Legacy access is one of the quiet miracles of bureaucracy. Passwords that never get changed. Systems stacked so deep no one remembers who set the first permissions. Departments drowning in fires, ignoring old doors because they assume no one still has the keys. But the cameras never forget. And the building always tells the truth. There he was, the boy executive, animated, confident, pointing at walls like a conqueror surveying a city he doesn't understand. Contractors nodding uncomfortably. Structural elements dismissed with hand gestures and buzzwords. Screenshots matter. Video matters. Documentation is the language of modern judgment. This wasn't spying, it was witnessing. Then came the permits, or rather the absence of them. Nothing filed, no approvals, no safeguards, just arrogance moving fast and assuming legality would catch up later. Because that's how it always works for people who have never been told no. This is where revenge stories usually turn loud. Threats, confrontations, ultimatums. That didn't happen because this was no longer personal. This was education. And education, when done properly, is irreversible. There's a moment when anger finishes burning and leaves behind something far more efficient. It's colder, sharper. It doesn't ask why this happened anymore. It asks what this allows me to do. That's where he was now. While the company celebrated Demolition Day, emails and buzzwords about collaboration, he watched quietly as reality drifted further from compliance. That's another thing you learn if you've been around long enough. Corporations don't collapse from villains. They collapse from enthusiasm unrestrained by competence. The all-hands meeting wasn't inspiring. It was revealing. A man with a headset mic shouting about the future to people who looked exhausted by the present. Performative energy masking structural ignorance. The kind of speech that sounds powerful until you realize it's designed to distract from what's actually being touched. And what was being touched mattered. Load-bearing columns don't care about vision statements. Servers don't respond to passion. Gravity doesn't negotiate. The building didn't stay standing because of culture. It stayed standing because someone once understood physics, math, and consequence. Here's the seventh forbidden truth. Executives confuse confidence with control. They think because they can approve budgets, they can override reality. Reality always collects. As he studied the renderings, something shifted from calculated to urgent. This wasn't just breach. This was endangerment. Employees still inside. Data humming through racks that weren't meant to move. Weight distribution about to be altered by a man who had never learned what failure actually costs. He picked up the phone again, not to threaten, not to boast, but to synchronize. Timing matters in these moments. Move too early and you look emotional. Move too late and you're complicit. The lawyer understood immediately. That's the mark of someone who's seen this before. No moral speeches. No questions about fairness. Just the quiet recalibration of strategy. Eviction papers prepared but not filed. Not yet. Because power isn't about speed, it's about sequencing. First, you let them step fully into the mistake. Then you turn on the lights. Outside, storm clouds gathered. Not dramatic, just appropriate. He didn't show up to the office the next morning. That would have given them someone to react to. Instead, he went somewhere far more dangerous for people like Brad, the machinery of the state. Fluorescent lights, long counters, women and men who have outlasted every corporate trend you've ever heard of. Here's the eighth forbidden truth. Government moves slowly, but when it moves with finality. Paperwork doesn't care about charisma. Forms don't bend for confidence. Compliance officers don't attend innovation summits. As certified copies slid across the counter, something became undeniable. The building wasn't just being misused, it was being violated. And violations trigger consequences no rebrand can fix. By the time the first hammer swung, the outcome was already sealed. If you want to understand how real power operates, watch what happens when institutions collide. Not men, not egos, systems. Slow, indifferent, unstoppable systems that don't care who you are or how confident you sound in meetings. By the time the city got involved, the story was no longer about a fired veteran. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about jurisdiction, authority, ownership, compliance, words that make executives nervous because they can't charm their way through them. Inspectors don't care about your vision. They care about measurements, about permits, about whether a column was touched without approval, about whether the people inside that building were put at risk so someone could feel innovative on a slide deck. Here's the ninth forbidden truth. The moment you shift a conflict from corporate space to civic space, the power dynamic flips completely. Inside the office, titles rule. Outside it, documentation does. When the first official notice landed, confusion spread faster than panic. Meetings were called, calls were made, voices rose, lawyers were looped in late, very late, because nobody plans for a landlord who remembers the fine print. And this is where you need to pause and recognize something important, because this isn't just his story anymore. This is about identity, about which side of the invisible line you stand on. Most men spend their lives trying to be indispensable to systems that would erase them without hesitation. A smaller number learn to position themselves outside those systems, close enough to benefit, distant enough to survive. If you're still listening, you're already closer to that second group than you realize. Right here, this is the halfway mark. And this is where I need you to do something deliberate, not for me, for yourself. To mark the moment when you stopped consuming a story and started absorbing a lesson. In the comments, write this phrase. Write it twice. I see the foundation. I see the foundation. Don't explain it. Don't decorate it. Just post it. Men who understand will recognize each other instantly. Back to the building. As enforcement notices stacked up, the illusion cracked. Employees were sent home temporarily. Servers were powered down as a precaution. Executives spoke in emergency tones they'd never practiced because no one trains for consequences, only growth. And somewhere in that chaos, the young VP realized something too late. He wasn't being attacked, he was being corrected. By forces he didn't know existed because no one had ever let him feel small before. The veteran didn't show up. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Absence was part of the lesson. When you own the ground, you don't need to stand on it to be felt. This wasn't revenge driven by rage. It was gravity reasserting itself. And once gravity speaks, everything else gets very quiet. Silence after impact is louder than any explosion. Once the inspectors left and the doors were sealed, the building stopped being a workplace and started being a liability. That shift happens fast. One day it's an address on a resume. The next, it's a line item no one wants to own. Inside the company, narratives scrambled. PR tried to frame it as a temporary pause. HR called it a safety-first decision. Leadership insisted it was proactive, but words don't change status codes. And the status code now read non-operational. Here's the 10th forbidden truth. Organizations don't fear failure, they fear exposure. Failure can be spun. Exposure can't. Exposure leaves timestamps. The board meeting that followed wasn't heated. It was surgical. No shouting. No heroics. Just men and women staring at documents they should have read years ago. Land records, lease clauses, photographs, signatures in ink that didn't care how modern the logo had become. That's when his name surfaced again, not as an employee, not as a problem, as a variable. Someone finally asked the right question, and you can tell it landed hard because the room went quiet afterward. Do we still need his consent? Consent is a word people misuse until it matters. They assume silence equals approval. That history equals irrelevance. That age equals expiration. This was the moment those assumptions collapsed under their own weight. Legal reached out carefully, respectfully. Not apologetic, corporations don't apologize unless compelled, but different. Tone changes our tells. They reveal who understands leverage and who is still pretending it doesn't exist. The message wasn't a threat. It was an inquiry. A request to talk. He didn't respond immediately. Here's the 11th forbidden truth. Timing is leverage's most underappreciated multiplier. When people are nervous, every unanswered hour feels like an accusation. While they waited, reality continued its work. Costs accrued, deadlines slipped. Clients asked questions that couldn't be answered with enthusiasm. Momentum, the thing they'd always relied on, was gone. When he finally replied, it was short, professional, precise. One sentence crafted to remind them who had the ground beneath their urgency. All future communication should be directed through my counsel. That line doesn't escalate, it clarifies. It tells the room the game has changed without raising your voice. From that moment on, the outcome stopped being uncertain, because the system had recognized him again, not as labor, not as age, not as history, but as authority. And once authority re-enters a conversation, arrogance doesn't survive long. The building stood empty, lights off, waiting, just like the people who suddenly remembered who built it.